All right, so what I want to talk about here today is the EU Cyber Resiliency Act and sort of the interaction with open source and with Copyleft. This will not be a detailed introduction to the CRA. There's other excellent courses available from the Linux Foundation on that, but we'll cover a bit of the basics with that, and then we'll dive into a specific piece of that legislation and sort of some of the impact that could have on open source. First of all, who am I? I'm Ahlberg. I'm the Director of Open Source Policy at Ericsson. As always, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, send me an email if you want to discuss the CRA, open chain, open source, licensing, or anything in general. And at Ericsson, I said I'm Director of Open Source Policy. That's, of course, as most things, just a made-up title. Doesn't really tell you anything about what I do. So, oops, right. So what is my job, actually? So partly I'm a lawyer. I'm trained as a lawyer. So acting in that capacity for Ericsson when it comes to open source matters. But being in the OSPO, that also means that I'm a guardian of Ericsson's IP assets, of its sort of investments made in R&D. Also a gardener in the sense that we need to grow sort of the open source ecosystem. We need to grow the open source culture internally. Translator between various needs of the business, between engineering, security, legal, business management, trying to ensure that we try to be the central point for that. And I think open source is very interesting because it exists sort of exactly in the intersection of all these things. But those are functions that doesn't necessarily speak the same language, so we try to act as translators. I view my job partly being a bit of a cultural anthropologist. That's a very hard word, so I'll take a moment to explain that. Cultural anthropologists are, they're the ones that study society, culture, and the humans that live in it, right? So some of those very brave people would go into the Amazon jungle, embed themselves with an indigenous tribe for 6 months or a year to understand their culture, how they live and function. I'm not that adventurous. I don't like mosquitoes, I don't like snakes, so I'm not going to go into the Amazon. So I decided to study the tribe of open source software developers instead. And this is how I embed myself with them. So, because all of this comes with, you need to have a certain credibility in order to function in that role. So, about the EU Cyber Resiliency Act. As I said, we'll not go into any great detail about it. We already checked to know about it. For those of you that don't, the clock is ticking. This legislation will come into full effect in December 2027, if I'm not mistaken. It applies to all products with digital elements that are put on the EU market. It's essentially a CE marking for software. So fundamentally what this legislation is about, it's reducing or increasing cyber resilience in the EU in certain product categories. It's fundamentally about not shipping software with known vulnerabilities. You're not allowed to do that under the EU CRA. It's about reporting vulnerabilities found to make that an obligation. It's about and this is what we'll mostly cover, it's about upstreaming your fixes. If you have if you found and resolved vulnerabilities, then you must upstream those to the relevant project. And it's also about providing software bill of material or being able to provide software bill of material to the national CSERTs in the various EU jurisdictions where you're selling your products. And if you're going to bring one thing with you from this, remember that it's potentially very, very expensive if you don't comply with this. A company could be fined up to 2.5% of their global annual turnover if you fail to comply with the EU CRA and its requirements. If you want to understand more about the EU CRA, I'd highly recommend this course from Linux Foundation and OpenSSF. I think this is really in-depth and a fantastic resource that I'm happy that they made available. Certainly have made my life easier when I need to explain this to people. I want to first just put into context a little bit of open source at Ericsson. So, I mean, we're a global company with a presence in more than 180 countries, about 95,000 employees, and a lot of the products and software that we sell is, uses open source or utilizes open source somehow. If we look in terms of components, last year we brought in 32,000 new components. That could be new versions of things we already had or something that's completely new. But that doesn't count the dependencies. Those are, the primary, as we would term them. So for us, it's a huge machinery needed to sort of manage all those open source components. And that will be very, very relevant under the EU Cyber Resiliency Act, because where we will have most of the known exploitable vulnerabilities will of course come from open source. Not because it's any less safe or any worse security in open source, but it's visible. You actually do have CVEs. We expect our customers will inspect our software, will inspect our software bill of material, and it's where it's visible, right? So all of those 32,000 components, now under the CRA, we need to enforce strict monitoring of them. We need to make sure that there's no known CVEs in them, and we also need to solve the technical debt that's built up in parts of the company over using old versions, because old versions, again, they will have more known CVEs attached to them and KEVs attached to them. Again, not because the newer versions are necessarily more secure, but we haven't found those yet, right? So anyway, this is what I call the CRA awareness curve when I speak to people internally in the company about that. And typically where people end up or start out is in denial. Well, we're not going to be impacted by the CRA, right? Unfortunately, you're probably going to be impacted by the CRA if you want to sell anything in Europe. There are few product categories that are exempt from the CRA, such as automotive or defense. But that's because they have more stringent EU legislation on them already. So unless you're in those categories, and even if you're in those categories, there might be some ancillary services and products that still will be covered by the CRA. So if your organizations or companies are active in Europe, most likely you will be impacted by this. Then you realize that, well, this is a huge risk for us. I mean, 2.5% of global annual turnover, if we fail to comply with that, that's not great. So people typically get to the bargaining state. Can we negotiate this with the Commission? And I'm sorry to say that ship has sailed since long. Now we're in the implementation phase of actually writing the horizontal and vertical standards that will give the presumption of conformance with the legislation. There's still some time, I think, to get involved, at least in the vertical standards, the product-specific standards, but my understanding is that the work on the horizontal standards is mostly done. Oops. I now got the reminder that I should be here and talking. Lucky I didn't need that. Okay, so what happened, right? Depression, we're screwed. We'll never be able to implement all the requirements in the CRA. It's not going to work. Hopefully, you'll get out on the other end in the acceptance stage, where, okay, we need to be smart about it. We need to develop strategies and processes to manage and implement these specifications that we'll get. Some of that will definitely be based around open source. because it is a huge part of everyone's supply chain here. What we're going to look at now is a very specific excerpt from the CRA. It's Article 13-6. And what I want us to look at is this section. I don't need to read that out aloud to you, but I can summarize it as, if you have developed a software or hardware modification to address a vulnerability in a component that you have, then you need, and if that's an open source component, you need to send that upstream. You need to contribute that. And that's now a legal requirement under the CRA that you do that. So I'm a visual person mostly, so let's try to see if we can make that any clearer. Say that we have an open source component. We find a vulnerability in said component. Under the CRA, we need to ask ourselves the question, have we developed a fix to this? Yes, no. That's a pretty binary question, right? If no, then it's only the reporting obligations. Those might be to the national CSIRTs, but they will at least always be to the owner or manufacturer of that component. In the case of open source, that's going to be to the open source project. If you find a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows or Azure, then Microsoft is the guys you need to talk to. But let's stick with the open source thing here. So if you have developed a fix, then the second question you need to ask yourself is, okay, is this under a permissive license or is this a copyleft license? I think the copyleft case is actually pretty interesting. But if it's a permissive license, then you could theoretically contribute this upstream under a proprietary license or another permissive license or any other kind of license, because that's the nature of permissive licensing. While if it's a copyleft license, well, likely your fix is a derivative work under that, meaning that it would need to keep that same license. For example, if we take the Linux kernel as an example, that's licensed under GPL version 2. That's a copyleft license, meaning any derivative work on that, any work based on that, needs to carry the same license. So in the case of copyleft, we no longer have that choice of how do we make that available to the upstream community. If this is indeed a derivative work, then we need to provide that upstream to that community under that license. So we need to contribute to the owner. And then it's possible that the owner or the open source project will implement it, but there's no requirement on that project to actually implement your fix. Because let's be honest, your fix might break other things, or it might be pure bad software. The obligation is on you to provide it. It's not on them to actually implement your fix. I think there are some very good reasons to provide quality software upstream, so that you get your fix involved, because if you don't, you will have a higher cost next time and a higher technical depth next time you need to upgrade to the latest version. So preferably you want to have your fixes accepted, but it's not a requirement that just because you have a fix, just because you have reported it, it's not a requirement on the project to actually implement that. This becomes interesting as well in a way if we have a contributors license agreements. Some projects require those and requires contributors to have signed those before they are allowed to contribute code into the project. Those are also legal agreements, and sometimes they're uncomplicated, but sometimes they could contain clauses or provisions that a organization might not be comfortable with. So I think that puts an interesting spin to this, for your selection of an open source component. Should we already, when we select something, knowing that might go into a product that will be subject to the CRA, should we already then evaluate, can we sign that CLA? Because if we need to, under the CRA, provide something upstream to that project, and we must sign the CLA, okay, then we should already at the evaluation stage say, is that something we can do or not? And if we can't, then I think that it's a severe risk that, you then put yourself in a position where you cannot comply with a key requirement in the CRA. And then that component, instead of sort of, being a good component for your product, becomes a liability. So what is the significance of this to open source? And there's plenty of things. First of all, I think it's the only and first time in EU legislation they have defined open source. They have also included a new concept called open source steward, which is the Linux Foundation will certainly be one, but we'll not go into that necessarily in this talk. Again, I refer back to the course from OpenSSF. But fundamentally, I think this shifts sort of the voluntary nature of contributions. Because typically companies will contribute what they think benefits them when it benefits them. With CRA, that changes. I think that, don't get me wrong, I think there's plenty of good reasons to contribute code upstream to a project, but there's always, that has to come with a business case that has to sort of make sense. Now with the CRA, that's no longer voluntary. That's not really a choice your organization has. So I think that puts an emphasis on what kind of processes a organization have internally to allow that contribution to happen, how you train your developers in how they should interact with the open source community. Because if you come into that with, the wrong cultural mindset, or don't understand the project, don't understand that community, it could easily go very wrong. And for me, I'm of the assumption that you actually will want your contribution to be accepted. You don't just do this as sort of tick in the box exercise. You want that to be accepted because that lowers your cost of ownership for that component next time you need to update, because your technical debt will be incrementally smaller. But over time, that will compound, of course, if you're active in this. So also with the CRA, there might be an impact in what free and open source components companies select. The security posturing of a project is such an impact. Is the project CRA ready? Is this under a license your company is okay contributing to? What's the health of the community and so forth? And another question is, okay, the legislation we looked at, that's only applicable if you have developed a fix. So will this impact some organizations' willingness to actually develop fixes? I don't know. I think we'll see. I hope that at least the intent is for the opposite, that it will impact positively organizations and manufacturers' policy of developing fixes. But we'll see how that plays out. I think there's also another interesting part in the CRA that focuses on remote data processing. That means data processing. Well, you can read this yourself, but essentially that's the software as a service scenario. So if I distribute something on the EU market, but I've kept some things as a service, only available as a cloud service. Normally, that wouldn't be covered under the CRA, but if to perform some of the core functions or the advertised functions of that product, if you're relying on that cloud service, that now becomes part of the CRA as well, and it becomes part of what you care about. From a Copyleft licensing perspective, I think that's interesting because that means that normal GPL is like a little bit step closer to a Affero or AGPL, where that have a network triggering effect, right? Because normally if we don't distribute something, we should care about GPL, but you don't have to do the full compliance. There are things that are only applicable at distribution, and in a cloud environment, distribution doesn't really happen. But with this writing in the CRA, I think that we get a little bit closer to this acting as a distribution, because we need to care more about it. In that, software as a service is not a shield to hide behind in that case. As an example of this, here is a Ericsson Cradlepoint router. I have one at home, they're great, but it also relies on an application on my phone that's, is the front end to a software as a service for how I manage my set of routers at home. So the software as a service, that's not distributed in the EU, but to use this router to the sort of intended use and effect, I need access to that software as a service platform, the NetCloud Manager. And what then happens is that those are sort of compounded, and both the router and that management software needs to conform to the CRA. If we look at some further details here, so this one I think is interesting as well in the writing, because it says they shall share the relevant code or documentation. So would it be possible, say that we now have our same scenario here, maybe the corporate policies, we don't contribute to GPL projects, or we don't want to contribute code into this specific project. There might be good reasons or might be bad reasons for it, but let's assume that those exist. Maybe it would be possible to sufficiently document the security vulnerability and your sort of the concept or proposal of your fix with that, and provide that as documentation. Might be other reasons why you would want to provide something as documentation, and I think we'll get to those here, like potential issues. Because if you have exclusivity with a customer, say that, well, everything for this customer project, you have the exclusive right for that. That could come at odds with your obligation to provide something upstream. Because if you provide it upstream, that's no longer exclusivity. And unless your agreement already have taken that scenario into account, you might be in a scenario where you're forced either to breach your exclusivity agreement with the customer or the CRA. And that's not a position you want to be in. It might also be, for example, in various R&D collaborations. We certainly have them with universities where there's joint ownership of the code or the copyright or patents generated within that collaboration. And the other party that you're in this R&D collaboration with, they might not be subject to CRA. They might say, well, that sounds like a you problem, that's not a me problem. I don't want this to be open source. I don't want this to be made available. So another key question here is, because the CRA is also centered around the concept of a manufacturer, which is someone who puts a product on the market. And need to ask yourself, are my suppliers, are they ready for the CRA? Have they thought about these things? Because if they are not ready for the CRA, you are not ready for the CRA, because you take responsibility for sort of the product you put with the components that have gone into that. And if they are faced with, oh, I need to deliver this piece of software, this component to this customer, but I can't put it on the EU market, which it would be when I deliver it to that customer, then they might say, well, we're not going to deliver because that's too big of a liability for us. And in the end, you are there with your sub-suppliers being like, all right, then we can't deliver our product. It's as good as if we were in CRA conformant, if we don't get this component. So I'm sure there are other potential issues in the CRA. Trying to outline some solutions. I mean, on the exclusivity thing, you could talk to your customers and partners. That would actually require your customers to be reasonable. As a lawyer, I'm very happy that people aren't always reasonable, because that means I have a job. Because that's when lawyers get involved, right? When we aren't reasonable. So, yeah, that's not a perfect one, but at least sort of bring that up in your organization to say, well, have our agreements taken, this into account, that we might need to contribute back upstream. Maybe most agreement probably contains a clause on abiding by all applicable laws. Maybe that's sufficient in a CRA context. Maybe it's not. I think we need to see that, especially since the CRA is judged on, your organization is judged on a global level. So if you have an R&D collaboration where something is done like in the US with a US subsidiary and a US partner, if they develop a fix to something to an open source component that you have in a product that's subject to the CRA, your organization is seen as aware of this, and your reporting obligation and the obligation to provide that fix kicks in globally. So you really need to have like global processes to manage this. It's not enough to say, well, the US entity can do whatever it wants because it's part of your group. It's part of what you're judged on. Yeah, okay, I had this example here. So a question for my lawyer friends is, do we need more specific language for the CRA? On the one hand, it might be good. On the other hand, we don't want to start pointing out every single legislation we think, we need to adopt to or apply to. But maybe saying if having more specific language, if it's a requirement to make something available, to comply with regulatory requirements, maybe should put some language on that in there. Another question is, if we as an organization, and legal text doesn't really cover this, but like, can I say to the open source project, I'm going to give you my code, but you need to sign an NDA to get that because it contains trade secrets? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure if I have fulfilled my obligations, if I sort of gatekeep that with an NDA that they would need to sign. And then again, if one can instead provide documentation, even if code exists that could be shared, I think that there are a few legitimate use cases where you might want to do that. If there's ownership issues, if there's exclusivity issues, and if the code, for example, would contain trade secrets that you're not willing to share or you can't share, that's a case where that could happen. I think most projects will probably not like it, and I think sort of a consensus will develop on that. That's really not the preferred methodology, but I do think that sort of taking into account all the existing flora of existing agreements that sort of built up over years, I think that that's a good safety event to have. But we'll see what the horizontal and vertical standard says about this, if there's further guidance from the Commission about this, because currently we only have legal text. So we don't know if this will be valid, if that's gonna work, or if documentation can only be shared when there isn't a software fix developed, or where it's not possible to fix the issue in software, right? If the vulnerability is a physical one, or sort of the manifestation of that is physical and the fix is physical, like I have a vulnerability with my laptop that you can plug in a USB drive in there. Okay, maybe assume it weren't possible to fix that with software. Okay, then the documented fix could be, okay, super glue that tight and turn that off, right? So those cases might exist. Yeah. Alrighty, yes. And then maybe have time for a question or two. I got the 5-minute sign a few minutes ago, but if there's questions or comments, either we can take them now or in the hallway track later. I see one comment from a gentleman in the back.
Judy, just a question about the official CRA standards. We're still pending the final version of those requirements, right? We don't yet have the full official requirement list. Is that correct?
That is correct. So there are two sets of, there's like 40 or so different standards, but the one that I think is sort of most interesting right now is the horizontal one, meaning that sets the bar, and that's the general standard. If your products aren't pointed to in one of the named product categories, then that's the standard that will apply to your product. There will be a lot of products, but what's also important with that is that sets the bar. You're not allowed to be sort of any less stringent in any of the vertical standards that will cover certain specific products than what the horizontal one does. So I think that's the big and important one now, but that also means that it's a little bit delayed, right? Because if they're not allowed, if the specific vertical standards for certain products are not allowed to be any less stringent than that horizontal standard, that work can't really start officially until they know what are the requirements in that one. So I think that poses a real challenge in the sense that, we need to start working now, or preferably we should start working on this yesterday, but we don't have the specification yet. So I think everyone is floundering a little bit on this, and I think some things we'll get right, some things we might get wrong. But what I do honestly believe is that if we start now, I think that will still be better than if we start, when the standards are out. I think there's a lot of work that is no-brainers, that is just good, secure software development and processes that we should have in place anyway. So I don't know if that answered the question at all, or if I'm just monologuing here, but hopefully it was enlightening. Okay, I think we have maybe time for one more question, if there are any. Otherwise, as I said, hallway track, I'm always available. Okay, thank you. Thanks for taking the time.